Hi, my name is Sipiwe Balega, and among other things, I am a historian, a genealogist, and a scholar. And I want to welcome you to my Black History Month presentation entitled Half the Story Has Never Been Told, Ethiopia, Malcolm X, and the Liberation Story They Didn't Tell You. This is actually part 3 of my presentation, and I hope you enjoy it. Narratives matter. The stories that are told and how they are told, they matter. I'm going to tell you a story, and I must start the story from the beginning. Otherwise, you won't understand the significance and the magnitude of the events in Malcolm X's life that I'm going to discuss at the end of this presentation. If you really want to understand, listen carefully. As my father once told me, you want to solve a problem, you must go to the origin of the problem. So let me start from the beginning. In part 1 of my presentation, I had discussed how the Earth's original people had started in East Africa, and what is usually referred to as Ethiopia, and migrated from Ethiopia down the Nile Valley and out of the continent and up, settled in the Indus Valley here, and then from there migrated up to what are called the Caucasus Mountains. Now, over the next 20 or 30,000 years, the Earth's original people that migrated to the Caucasus Mountains, their genes mutated and changed, and they became a new people, right, with new genotypes. And in order to escape the cold climate and what's called the worm glaciation, these people, we'll call them Caucasians, had migrated down following the Tigris and Euphrates River and down into this valley. And when they migrated, there they found some of the Earth's original people that were already living there. And they mixed with these people, creating what are called Indo-Europeans. They're also called Semites. Now, in 31 BC, the Romans, I'm skipping a lot of the story, but in 31 BC, the Romans conquer Egypt. Ethiopia remains free and independent. The war between Rome and the Jews begins, and the war between Rome and Ethiopia begins. So just to go back, these Indo-Europeans, they come back into Africa. And here they find that Earth's original people and their civilizations. And this is going to start a conflict. And for over 1,000, over 1,500 years, these Indo-Europeans attack and fight the Earth's original people who keep moving south to maintain their freedom. They keep migrating south to Ethiopia, and then they're going to migrate through this, what they call the Sahel corridor, in between the desert and the forest. They're going to migrate all the way over to West Africa. Okay, in 31 BC, the Romans conquer Egypt, and this war between Rome and Ethiopia begins. A 4th century forged Roman imperial decree called the Donation of Constantine supposedly transferred authority over Rome and the western part of the Roman Empire to the Pope. These lands would become the papal states and would become the basis of the papacy's temporal power or worldly power for the next 11 centuries. According to this forgery, supremacy as well, the church would have supremacy as well over the 4 principal sees: Alexandria, Antioch, Jerusalem, and Constantinople, and also over the churches of God in the whole earth. This is the beginning of a religious supremacy that is going to attempt to take over the entire earth. Skipping a lot more, right? Now we're 1,000 years later. In 1415, Prince Henry the Navigator learns about the gold and slave trade from Jews and Moors in Fez and decides to invade the land of Guinea on the west coast of Africa. The papal bull Dum Diversas, issued by Pope Nicholas V on June 18, 1452, states, we grant to you full and free power through the apostolic authority by this edict to invade, conquer, fight, subjugate the Saracens and pagans and other infidels and other enemies of Christ, and to lead their persons in perpetual servitude, and to apply and appropriate realms, duchies, royal palaces, principalities, and other dominions, possessions, and goods of this kind to you and your use and your successors, the King of Portugal. So Prince Henry goes to the Pope and says, look, I got this plan. There's all these golden slaves. We can cut out the middleman, go and sail around West Africa, and we can get the golden slaves for ourselves. And the Pope says, okay, I give you the authority to do this. And now they have deified their emperor and Pope, and they set out to rule the world under this planetary, divine, religious supremacy that they basically just invented. They just say, we have this authority from God, and we wrote it on this piece of paper, so therefore it's the law. They just made it up. Through a contract known as the Asiento, companies and individuals are granted the exclusive rights to engage in the slave trade. The Asiento constituted the principal legal means of supplying slaves to Spanish America. The Portuguese dominated the monopolistic Asiento until 1640. The contract fell to the Dutch in 1675, to the Portuguese again in 1694, to the French in 1701, and finally to the English in 1713. Regardless of who held the Asiento, the Pope and the Catholic Church received 50% of the profits, making them the single greatest beneficiaries of the transatlantic trade. And thus begun what would become known as the transatlantic slave trade. 36,000 voyages are documented. And when you take into consideration all the deaths, the transatlantic slave trade depopulated the African continent of 170 million. Now, every African that arrived in America prayed to leave America and return home. None of them were Christian, and many of them first heard of Jesus from the 478 slave ships so named. 1783, George Lyle of Savannah, Georgia, born in Virginia, established the first Ethiopian Baptist church, calling his followers Ethiopian Baptists, and officially launching the Ethiopianist movement and Ethiopianism. There followed slaves and free Negroes alike who led back to Africa missions and insurrections in pursuit of liberation. These included Paul Cuffey, Daniel Coker, Lot Carey, Denmark Vesey, David Walker, Nat Turner, Henry Harlan Garnett, and Martin Delany, who said in 1859, our policy must be Africa for the African race and Black men to rule them. After the Nat Turner Revolt in 1831, a decision was made by the leading theologians in America to teach the slaves a form of Christianity designed to make them docile and obedient so as to prevent any future insurrections. This did not stop slaves and free Negroes from desiring to leave America and return to Africa. More and more began reading the Bible and learning of Ethiopia and prophecies that they would someday return. Just prior to the Civil War in the United States, there was a great expectation among the slaves and most of the free Blacks to leave America to return to Africa or to go to Haiti or some other place. National Negro conventions on the subject of emigration were convened. And then came Frederick Douglass, who organized anti-immigration conferences and said emigration was uncalled for, unwise, unfortunate, and premature. And he asked that no appropriation whatever, state or national, be granted to the colonization scheme. Douglass sparked the first public debate among American Negro leaders on the subject of emigration, and for the first time, created a great division among so-called Black leaders on the future of Black people in America. By the time the Civil War ended, Douglass, supported by abolitionists and white liberals, convinced the nation that the emancipated should remain in America. Thus, Frederick Douglass launched the integration movement to counter the demand for land independence and return to Africa. Meanwhile, on the African continent, the European nations had been authorized by the Pope to depopulate the African continent of 170 million people and to seize everything for their own use. By 1884, the European nations convened a Berlin conference to settle once and for all which nation owned which parts of Africa. You can see from the map right here, it's only Ethiopia that remains as the last free, unconquered, and independent people in Africa. And thus, Ethiopia must make a final heroic stand to save all Black people everywhere. Several African Americans in Chicago start prophesizing about war with Ethiopia and Ethiopia's redemption. This is in 1917, and the coming of a universal Black king from Ethiopia in 1919. That same year, Ethiopia sends 4 ambassadors to the United States and tells them, Black people in America, to return. And Black people in America start preparing to leave again. They interpret these events as fulfillment of biblical prophecy and pledge their allegiance to the Ethiopian government and heir to the throne, Ras Tafari. Ethiopianism spreads from Chicago to New York and from there to Jamaica and elsewhere. On October 7th, 1928, Rastafari is indeed crowned Negus, or King of Ethiopia. And 2 years later, on November 2nd, 1930, King Tafari is crowned Emperor of Ethiopia and given the coronation name Haile Selassie. The Chicago Defender of November 8th pictured Rastafari with the caption, "Crowned King of Kings," and a front page story announced, amid splendor and pomp that would have put the Roman Empire in its palmy days into the shade, His Majesty Rastafari, this ruler of Ethiopia, was crowned Haile Selassie I, King of Kings, Lord of Lords, conquering Lion of Judah, and elect of God. And his ancestry traces back to King Solomon. So this is how it's being reported in the international press. Chicago Defender. There's a picture in the Crisis magazine that's published by Du Bois. National Geographic devotes their entire June 1930 issue June 1931 issue to the coronation. And by 1932, the peace movement of Ethiopia sent petitions containing the names of 400,000 members of African Americans, and these were sent to President Roosevelt saying, "We want to return to Ethiopia." Now, on June 15, 1935, the Chicago Defender stated in big bold letters atop its front cover, "War in Ethiopia by September." Above pictures of Emperor Haile Selassie, they quoted as saying, "I'm not only Emperor of Africa, I am King of all Negroes everywhere, including those in the United States and other foreign domains. The Italian warlord is trying to destroy the last best hope that you have on earth." Let's go back. Remember, right? By this time, there's only one group of free, unconquered, independent people, the Ethiopians. And here you can see the Italian colonies. Italy didn't have very rich and prosperous colonies because all the resources were here. And what they wanted to do was conquer Ethiopia and connect their colonies so that they could become a colonial power just like the French and the British. On July 20th, another headline appears. Ethiopian conflict stirs the world. Is Ethiopia stretching forth her hands? Believe the world headed for biblical Armageddon. World uprising in the Italian-Ethiopian war foreseen by writer. Forthcoming conflict may be the fulfillment of biblical prophecies. Would-be race war, end of white domination is possible outcome. This is how it's being reported in the newspapers in the Black community in America. And in Chicago, 5,000 Black men volunteered to defend Ethiopia, but were prevented by the United States government. In September 1935, Ethiopian Emperor Haile Selassie signs the general mobilization order for his troops to defend against the Italian invasion. A Chicagoan, Colonel John Robinson, becomes the emperor's pilot and trains the Ethiopian Air Force. Black people all over the world volunteer to go to Ethiopia and fight to defend the last sovereign nation in Africa. Martin Luther King Sr. oversees the Ethiopian defense fundraising in the state of Georgia. Pope Pius XI blesses the Italian fascist dictator Benito Mussolini to invade Ethiopia in violation of the Charter of the League of Nations, starting the ultimate battle to once and for all destroy the Ethiopians. The conflict is considered by Ethiopians around the world as the fulfillment of Revelation 16 and 17. On May 5th, 1941, exactly 5 years to the day that Italy invaded Ethiopia, Haile Selassie returned to his throne, having defeated the Italians. The land and waters had been poisoned. 3 out of 4 educated Ethiopians were killed, and the emperor now had the task of rebuilding his nation. Emperor Haile Selassie resumed his program to bring African Americans back to their ancestral original homeland, and he traveled to the United States in 1954 to personally invite them to come back home. Sensitive to embarrassment before the world that the specter of racial segregation, particularly in education, might have during the visit of a Black emperor of Ethiopia, the U.S. passed the Brown versus Board of Education decision when it did, just 1 week before His Imperial Majesty's arrival, in order to show off the progress that the United States was making in race relations, and to prevent African Americans from accepting Haile Selassie's offer of repatriation. That offer included a house rent-free, a salary at least equaling that which applicants are now earning or could earn in America, free transportation to Ethiopia for applicants and their families, annual 3 months vacations with pay, and in some instances, automobiles provided by the government. Persons interested in applying for employment in Ethiopia or receiving additional information are advised to write the Ethiopian Embassy in Washington. The United States State Department decided that they couldn't allow the emperor to come and talk about this. So they passed the Brown versus Board of Education decision 5 days before the emperor arrived, and they orchestrated a media blackout on the repatriation offer. They only reported on the Brown versus Board of Education decision and kept asking the emperor what did he think about that decision to try to give Black Americans hope for a life in America. So once again, just like at the end of the Civil War, everybody's ready to go back to Africa, and they use integration to sabotage that. It's the same thing happens in 1954. Now, by this time, the Mau Mau freedom fighters had started fighting in Kenya and were being put in concentration camps by the British. Malcolm X, who had just been made chief minister of the Nation of Islam's Harlem Mosque No. 7, travels to Bandung, Indonesia to attend the first conference of non-aligned nations in 1955. Said Malcolm, in Bandung was the first unity meeting in centuries of Black people. And once you study what happened at the Bandung conference and the results, it actually serves as a model for the same procedure you and I can use to get our problems solved. At Bandung, all the nations came together from Africa and Asia. Some of them were Buddhists, some of them were Muslims, some were Christians, some were Confucianists, and some were atheists. Despite their religious differences, they came together. Some were communists, some were socialists, some were capitalists. Despite their economic and political differences, they came together. All of them were Black, brown, red, or yellow. The number one thing that was not allowed to attend the Bandung conference was the white man. He couldn't come. And once they excluded the white man, they found that they could get together. Once they kept him out, everybody else fell right in and fell in line. This is the thing that you and I have to understand. These people who came together didn't have nuclear weapons, they didn't have jet planes, they didn't have all of the heavy armaments that the white man has, but they had unity. So this is where Malcolm X learns and gets this vision that he's going to develop into his political philosophy later on down the road. Right after that, though, on December 1st, 1955, in downtown Montgomery, Rosa Parks refused to move to the back of the bus. A small moment of defiance that would lead to the resurgence of the Black liberation struggle in America. And this is where half the story has never been told. Okay, here we go. In the spring and summer of 1955, Malcolm makes his first trips abroad, visiting Ghana, Sudan, Nigeria, Iran, Syria, Egypt, and the United Arab Republic. Illness prevents him from traveling to Mecca. He meets with President Gamal Abdel Nasser of Egypt. 2 years after this, Ghana is the first to achieve their independence. At that time, Martin Luther King Jr. says, "Now don't think that because they have 5 million people, the nation can't grow, that that's a small nation to be overlooked. Never forget the fact that when America was born in 1776, when it received its independence from the British Empire, there were fewer, less than 4 million people in America. And today, it's more than 160 million. So never underestimate a people because it is small now. America was smaller than Ghana when it was born. Ghana has something to say to us. It says to us first that the oppressor never voluntarily gives freedom to the oppressed. You have to work for it. And if Nkrumah and the people of the Gold Coast had not stood up persistently, revolting against the system, it would still be a colony of the British Empire. Freedom is never given to anybody, for the oppressor has you in domination because he plans to keep you there, and he never voluntarily gives it up. And that is where the strong resistance comes. Privileged classes never give up their privileges without strong resistance. If we wait for it to work itself out, it will never be worked out. Freedom only comes through persistent revolt, through persistent agitation, and through persistently rising up against the system of evil. The bus protest is just the beginning. Dr. King had already begun to promote going back to Africa. In his sermon, The Birth of a New Nation, which was delivered at Dexter Avenue Baptist Church on April 7th, 1957, Dr. King stated, "Yes, there is a wilderness ahead, though it is my hope that even people from America will go to Africa, right there to the Gold Coast, and lend their technical assistance, for there is a great need and there are rich opportunities there. Right now is the first time that American Negroes can lend their technical assistance to a growing new nation. I was very happy to see already people who have moved in and making good. The son of the late president of Bennett College, Dr. Jones, is there, who started an insurance company and is making good, going to the top. A doctor from Brooklyn, New York, had just come in that week, and his wife is also a dentist. And they are living there now, going in there and working, and the people love them. There will be hundreds and thousands of people, I'm sure, going over to make for the growth of this new nation. And Nkrumah made it very clear to me that he would welcome any person coming there. There is a great day ahead. The future is on its side. It's going now through the wilderness, but the promised land is ahead." Shortly after this, Malcolm X visited Kenya in 1959 and developed a friendship with Pio Gama Pinto, a member of the ruling Kenyan African National Union. Pinto was responsible for organizing and arming the Mau Mau liberation fighters. Together, they planned a common strategy to deal with the daily humiliations and indignities suffered by both Africans and African Americans. 1960 becomes the year of Africa. Okay, after Haile Selassie defends Ethiopian independence, he helps the other African people start their fight for liberation. And by 1960, 17 countries received their independence. By 1963, 32 nations in Africa had liberated themselves and established independent nations. Encouraged, Malcolm X intensified the Black liberation struggle in America. Black Americans were going to achieve independence too. 1962, Max Stanford, now Ahmed Muhammad, engaged with Malcolm X and told him he was a revolutionary interested in following him and the Nation of Islam. Malcolm X told Stanford that if he was truly revolutionary, he would be better off working outside the Nation of Islam. Stanford went forward to become a founding member of the Revolutionary Action Movement. The Black Guard was a national armed youth self-defense group run by RAM that argued for protecting the interests of Black America by fighting directly against its enemies. The Black Guard, in Max Stanford's words, was to stop our youth from fighting amongst themselves, teach them a knowledge of Black history, and prepare them to protect our community from racist attacks. In 1964, Malcolm X became a RAM officer. At that time, they published Soul Book, the revolutionary journal of the Black world. It was a radical Black culture magazine edited by future Black power activists Bobby Seale, Huey Newton, Ernie Allen, and others. In the spring of 1964, Malcolm traveled to Africa for the third time. On April 12th, Malcolm X returned to Detroit to support his friends, including Milton Henry, a Tuskegee Airman and graduate from Yale Law School in 1950, who had created the Freedom Now Party. That night, Malcolm X gave his famous "The Ballot or the Bullet" speech, stating, "It is our intention to have a Black nationalist convention, which will consist of delegates from all over the country who are interested in the political, economic, and social philosophy of Black nationalism. After these delegates convene, we will hold a seminar. We will hold discussions. We will listen to everyone. We want to hear new ideas and new solutions and new answers. And at that time, if we see fit, then to form a Black nationalist party, we'll form a Black nationalist party. If it is necessary to form a Black nationalist army, we'll form a Black nationalist army." The Afro-American Student Conference on Black Nationalism took place at the beginning of May 1964 at Fisk University in Nashville, Tennessee. It was so controversial that the rival Nashville student movement brought Dr. Martin Luther King to the campus that same weekend. King's public reaction to the conference was to foolishly attack it as reverse racism. However, according to RAM founder Muhammad Ahmad, from the conference, the Black Liberation Front and RAM organizers went into the South to work with SNCC. With permission of SNCC chairman John Lewis, an experimental Black nationalist self-defense project was started in Greenwood, Mississippi. In discussion with the Mississippi field staff of SNCC, Black Liberation Front RAM organizers found the staff was prepared to establish a statewide armed self-defense system. They were also prepared to move in an all-Black nationalist direction. All that was needed was money to finance the project. Most of the Black members of the Mississippi SNCC field staff thought that the majority of Black people were beyond the voter registration stage. A second National Afro-American Student Conference was held at Fisk in the fall of 1964. Illustrative of the anti-Black nationalist bias in African-American history is the fact that while Black nationalist and revolutionary student movement was birthed at Fisk University, all we ever hear about is the nonviolent student sit-ins in Nashville at the same time. In the book From Civil Rights to Black Liberation, Malcolm X and the Organization of Afro-American Unity, William Sales notes, paralleling these discussions and in as much secrecy were discussions Malcolm X had with RAM through its field secretary, Muhammad Ahmed. As Ahmed remembered it, in June 1964, he and Malcolm worked out the structure of a revolutionary nationalist alternative to be set up within the civil rights movement. They also outlined the role of the OAAU in this alternative. The OAAU was to be the broad front organization, and RAM, the underground Black Liberation Front of the USA. Malcolm, in his second trip to Africa, was to try to find places for eventual political asylum and political military training for cadres. While Malcolm was in Africa, the field chairman was to go to Cuba to report the level of progress to Robert Williams. As Malcolm prepared Africa to support our struggle, Robert F. Williams would prepare Latin America and Asia. During this period, Malcolm began to emphasize that Afro-Americans could not achieve freedom under the capitalist system. He also described guerrilla warfare as a possible tactic to be used in the Black liberation struggle here. His slogan, "Freedom by any means necessary," has remained in the movement to this day. These discussions, in fact, reflected the impact of Malcolm's interaction with the representatives of national liberation movements and guerrilla armies during his trip to Africa. He was very much focused on establishing an equivalent structure within the African American freedom struggle. On June 14, 1964, the Sunday edition of the Washington Star featured an interview with Malcolm X in which he announced the formation of his new political group, the Afro-American Freedom Fighters. In this interview, Malcolm X emphasized the right of Afro-Americans to defend themselves and to engage in guerrilla warfare. A change of direction was rapidly made, however. As Ahmed reported, Malcolm's premature public posture on armed self-defense and guerrilla warfare frightened those in the nationalist camp who feared government repression. They feared giving public exposure to organizing efforts for self-determination and guerrilla warfare. Malcolm agreed, and the name of the new organization became the Organization of Afro-American Unity. The OAAU was to be the organizational platform for Malcolm X as the international spokesperson for RAM's revolutionary nationalism. But the nuts and bolts of creating a guerrilla organization were not to take place inside the OAAU. The OAAU was to be an above-ground united front engaged in legitimate activities to gain international recognition for the African American freedom struggle. Here's a telegram that Malcolm sent to Martin Luther King, June 30th, 1964. It says, "We have been witnessing with great concern the vicious attacks of the white racists against our poor defenseless people there in Augustine, in Florida. If the federal government will not send troops to your aid, just say the word and we will immediately dispatch some of our brothers there to organize self-defense units among our people. And the Ku Klux Klan will then receive a taste of its own medicine. The day of turning the other cheek to those brute beasts is over. Signed, the Organization of Afro-American Unity, Malcolm X, Chairman." On July 2nd, 1964, President Lyndon Johnson signed the Civil Rights Act. 2 days after the Civil Rights Act was passed, Milton and Malcolm's group on Advanced Leadership acted. According to Milton's brother Richard, the rifle clubs would be for going south in the moments of siege and for getting guns into the hands of willing and needy blacks in the fascist South when the time comes. The goal leader predicted that proportioned underground warfare by Negroes would come to the South. When that happens, he said, the Northern Rifle Clubs would back Negroes in besieged towns under attack by whites seeking to retaliate for their acts of the underground. Meanwhile, on July 13th, 1964, Martin Luther King Jr. received a letter from the Ethiopian embassy in Washington, D.C., inviting him to attend the 73rd birthday anniversary of Emperor Haile Selassie on July 23rd. That same year, both Martin Luther King Jr. and Emperor Haile Selassie made the shortlist for the Nobel Peace Prize. A few months later, Martin Luther King Jr. was indeed awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. Malcolm X made another longer African trip, accompanied by Milton Henry, from July to November 1964. They visited a string of countries there and met a range of intellectuals and political figures. As the leader and representative of the Black liberation struggle in America, Malcolm X was allowed to distribute a memorandum to the African leaders at the OAU on July 17th. It stated, "Since the 22 million of us were originally Africans who are now in America, not by choice, but only by a cruel accident in our history, we strongly believe that African problems are our problems and our problems are African problems. The American government is either unable or unwilling to protect the lives and property of your 22 million African American brothers and sisters. We stand defenseless at the mercy of American racists who murder us at will for no reason other than we are Black and of African descent. We have lived for over 300 years in that American den of racist wolves, in constant fear of losing life and limb. Recently, 3 students from Kenya were mistaken for American Negroes and were brutally beaten by the New York police. If South Africa is guilty of violating the human rights of Africans on the mother continent, then America is guilty of worse violations of the 22 million Africans on the American continent. And if South African racism is not a domestic issue, then American racism also is not a domestic issue. We beseech the independent African states to help us bring our problem before the United Nations on the grounds that the United States government is morally incapable of protecting the lives and the property of 22 million African Americans. This was reported in the international press, and the New York Times ran an article that says Malcolm X bids Africans take Negro issue to the United Nations. In his message, Malcolm X said, "We assert the right of self-defense by whatever means necessary and reserve the right of maximum retaliation against our racist oppressors, no matter what the odds against us are." After attending the OAU meeting in Cairo, Malcolm X, among other things, gave a lecture to students at Haile Selassie University in Addis Ababa, Ethiopia. During my own travels there and work at the African Union and the Institute of Ethiopian Studies in 2003, I learned that Malcolm X had been given instructions to unite his followers, mostly Muslims in the north, and Dr. King's followers, mostly Christians and in the south, under one umbrella organization. This was necessary to signal the African nations that African Americans were truly ready for their liberation struggle and national independence. Only then could the African nations at the OAU provide arms and military training while taking the United States before the United Nations. Was Emperor Haile Selassie's invitation to Dr. King an attempt to get both he and Malcolm X together in the same room to receive direct instructions from the King of Kings and Lord of Lords, conquering Lion of Judah, so that the next African nation to achieve independence would be a republic of New Africa across the Atlantic? Attorney Clarence Jones, Dr. Martin Luther King's trusted confidant and money man, said in an interview, after Malcolm's trip to Mecca, he changed. He started speaking to me in very respectful terms of his admiration for the courage of Martin. Often, Jones would attend secret summits with Malcolm X, African-American scholar John Henrik Clarke, intellectual and civil rights figure John Killens, activist Ozzie Davis, and Ruby Dee, and others. It was like a black caucus of political thinkers, he recalls. My job was to collect insights gleaned from these sessions and share them privately with Martin. In the summer of 1964, Malcolm predicted that the Afro-Americans would eventually be forced to resort to terroristic tactics as other colonized people had done to achieve their freedom. By November 1964, he had been convinced that revolutionary struggle was the only alternative that Afro-Americans had in the face of the continued repression and resistance to their efforts to gain their rights within the established political system. The refusal of the Democratic Party leaders to seat the Black representatives of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party at the Democratic Convention in August 1964, coupled with the brutalities inflicted on Black people during and after the Mississippi elections, underscored the futility of trying to work with a corrupt and morally defunct political system. After listening to Fannie Lou Hamer's account of her experience both in Mississippi and in Atlantic City with the leaders of the Democratic Party, Malcolm concluded that to communicate with white America, Afro-Americans needed to change the language of force and brutality and adopt methods such as those used by the Kenyan freedom fighters. Said Malcolm, "You and I can best learn how to get real freedom by studying how Kenyatta brought it to his people in Kenya and how Odinga helped him, and the excellent job that was done by the Mau Mau freedom fighters. In fact, that's what we need in Mississippi. In Mississippi, we need a Mau Mau. Right here in Harlem, in New York City, we need a Mau Mau. I say it with no anger. I say it with careful forethought. We need a Mau Mau. If they don't want to deal with the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, then we'll give them something else to deal with. And if they don't want to deal with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, then we have to give them an alternative." Let's see if I can get this video to play. Ella Baker, an unheralded, largely, untalked about, she was the brains behind the civil rights movement. She said, until the killing of Black men and Black mothers' sons becomes as important to the rest of the country as the killing of a white mother's son, we who believe in freedom cannot rest until this happens. Here we are today, police brutality, Black Lives Matter, George Floyd, my cousin Jacob Blake, right? The killing of Black men, Black mothers' sons, and we're still there. Now, Malcolm went on to say, you haven't got a revolution that doesn't involve bloodshed, and you're afraid to bleed. I said, you're afraid to bleed. As long as the white man sent you to Korea, you bled. He sent you to Germany, you bled. He sent you to the South Pacific to fight the Japanese, you bled. You bleed for white people, but when it comes time to seeing your own churches being bombed and little Black girls being murdered, you haven't got no blood. William Sales writes, the MMI and the OAAU were well infiltrated by agents and informants, the FBI and other governmental intelligence organizations, including Army Intelligence, Navy Intelligence, and the New York Police Department's Bureau of Special Services, BOSS. Gene Roberts, a bodyguard of Malcolm X and the OAAU, later surfaced as a New York City policeman assigned by BOSS to surveillance of the OAAU. The State Department viewed Malcolm's activities in Africa and his strategy of citing the United States for infractions of African Americans' human rights in international forums as a threat to the national security. Declassified government documents indicated that the State Department asked the CIA division that was later implicated in the overthrow and assassination of several third world leaders to take covert actions against Malcolm X. These documents further indicate that on August 11, 1964, 2 days before the New York Times article shown here, Benjamin H. Reed, Executive Secretary of the State Department, contacted Richard Helms, CIA Deputy Director for Plans, who was in charge of both the Domestic Operations Division and the African Operations Division, urging Helms to use the Clandestine Services Division to investigate Malcolm X. Reed was also concerned that Malcolm's plan to go to the United Nations might seriously damage the reputation of the United States as a cultural and racial melting pot. The only other nation besides Nazi Germany to have been so charged was South Africa. And in the New York Times article, August 13, 1964, it says, in a letter from Cairo to a friend, Malcolm wrote, I've gotten several promises of support in bringing our plight before the UN this year. And then the article also says, if United States Supreme Court Justice Arthur Goldberg a few weeks ago could find legal grounds to threaten to bring Russia before the United Nations and charge her with violating the human rights of less than 3 million Russian Jews, what makes our African brothers hesitate to bring the United States government before the United Nations and charge her with violating the human rights of 22 million African Americans? Malcolm said, we have to elevate our freedom struggle above the domestic level of civil rights. At the end of '64, SNCC extended invitations to Malcolm X to come to speak and visit their operations in Greenwood, Mississippi and Selma, Alabama. According to Ahmad, this was the beginning of the implementation of the strategy in which Malcolm X was to be the mass spokesman for armed defense units that would be centered around him and a Black United Front. And remember, Nelson Mandela had once said, when a man is denied the right to live the life he believes, he has no when a man is denied the right to live the life he believes in, he has no choice but to become an outlaw. By December of 1964, Malcolm X had told an audience, I, for one, would like to impress, especially upon those who call themselves leaders, the importance of realizing the direct connection between the struggle of the Afro-American in this country and the struggle of our people all over the world. As long as we think, as one of my good brothers mentioned out of the side of his mouth here a couple of Sundays ago, that we should get Mississippi straightened out before we worry about the Congo, you'll never get Mississippi straightened. By January 4th, 1965, the New York Times was reporting that 34 African heads of state were ready to support Malcolm X's Organization of Afro-American Unity's petition to the United Nations, and that the US State Department, the CIA, and the FBI noticed that African leaders were now openly attacking the United States. Again, William Sales writes, CIA documents indicated that the State Department had taken up the matter of Malcolm's UN petition idea with President Lyndon Johnson, who in turn asked J. Edgar Hoover to secure further information. Hoover, in turn, contacted Burke Marshall of the Justice Department Civil Rights Section, who initiated inquiries with Malcolm X's biographer, Alex Haley, and other civil rights leaders about Malcolm X's foreign ties and financial resources. When Hoover's investigation failed to turn up any legal improprieties on Malcolm's part, Reed again approached Helms, asking him to use the Clandestine Services Division to penetrate Malcolm X's foreign connections before the UN petition became a crisis for the Johnson administration. There is no record of the CIA's acting on Reed's request. However, FBI documents indicated that the FBI's Newark field office reported to Hoover its attempts to develop new contacts in the Newark Nation of Islam temple in the months immediately preceding Malcolm X's assassination. Malcolm's alleged assassins came out of that temple. And in this United States Department letter over here, they're talking about how this Malcolm X's finances, how he had just received a $20,000 advance for the book that he was writing, his autobiography with Alex Haley. So he was getting legitimate money support. And they realized they couldn't do to him what they did to Marcus Garvey, which was get him on, money laundering and fraud and tax and all that stuff. By February 16, 1965, Malcolm X was denouncing the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision as tokenism. From 1954 to 1964 can easily be looked upon as the era of the emerging African state. And as the African state emerged, what effect did it have on the Black American? When he saw the Black man on the African continent taking a stand, it made him become filled with the desire to take a stand. Just as the US had to change their approach with the people on the African continent, they also began to change their approach with our people on this continent. As they used tokenism on the African continent, they began to do the same thing with us here in the States, tokenism. Every move they made was a token move. They came up with a Supreme Court decision that they haven't put into practice yet, not even in Rochester, much less in Mississippi. Malcolm also said, the present American system can never produce freedom for the Black man. A chicken cannot lay a duck egg because the chicken's system is not designed or equipped to produce a duck egg. The American system, political, economic, and social, was produced from the enslavement of the Black man. And this present system is capable only of perpetuating that enslavement. In order for a chicken to produce a duck egg, its system would have to undergo a drastic and painful revolutionary change or revolution. So be it with America's enslaving system. A week later, on February 21st, Malcolm X was murdered. A month earlier, Burundi Prime Minister Pierre Ngendandumwe, a major supporter of the OAAU petition, was assassinated by Gonzalve Muyinzi, a man who worked at the US Embassy where the CIA was located. 4 days after Malcolm X's murder, Pio Gamo Pinto, who had supported the OAAU petition, was also assassinated. Malcolm X was killed on February 21st, 1965. 3 weeks later, the New York Times ran a story headlined, World Court Opens Africa Case Monday, which stated, the International Court of Justice will open oral proceedings Monday in a case linking the segregation struggle of the American Negro and the fate of 430,000 African Bantus and Bushmen. At issue is a 4-year effort by Ethiopia and Liberia to bar South Africa from applying her race separation or apartheid doctrine in Southwest Africa, which she controls. The two African complainants, searching for arguments to defeat race separation policy, have hit on the obvious parallels between the two separations. Almost certainly, they will cite the American school segregation case, beginning with the history-making decision of May 1954 in Brown versus Board of Education, in which the Supreme Court found that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal. So here, Emperor Haile Selassie has turned the tables. On June 22nd, 1971, the New York Times reported that World Court says South Africa errs, stating the International Court of Justice said in an advisory ruling today that South Africa was occupying Southwest Africa illegally and that it should end its administration of the territory at once, with a view to self-determination for all population groups. Okay? So now the principle of self-determination for African colonies has been upheld. And so Malcolm X was attempting to use that same system to recognize that the Black Belt nation in the South, where Blacks were the majority, was an internal colony of America that also had the right to self-determination. But our case was never submitted to the World Court of Justice because of Malcolm's assassination and the aftermath. Regarding Malcolm X's petition to the United Nations and the start of the Southwest Africa case, His Imperial Majesty Haile Selassie said, "In South Africa and Southwest Africa, the policies of apartheid and oppression are becoming increasingly unbearable. The South African government, note, like the US government and their Federal Bureau of Investigation's counterintelligence program, or COINTELPRO, is accelerating its ruthless campaign, a methodological campaign of arresting daily, detaining without trial, and torturing the Africans and their leaders who are struggling for their fundamental human rights and freedom. All the peace-loving countries of the world must act together to force the colonial governments of South Africa and Portugal to desist from these policies, policies which are inhuman, policies which are detrimental to the peace and security of the entire world, and they must grant independence and freedom to these oppressed people." A year later, while at the Organization of African Unity on July 7, 1966, Emperor Haile Selassie said, "You are meeting today in this very hall which gave birth to the Organization of African Unity, barely 2.5 years ago, in order to consider and find a solution to the Southern Rhodesian situation, which has posed a grave challenge not only to the OAU, but also to the independence of our individual states, and indeed to the national liberation movements of Angola, Mozambique, Southwest Africa, South Africa. All forces of good, wherever they may be found, must be mobilized to uproot the white supremacists in Rhodesia and in Southern Africa. All freedom-loving peoples must cooperate to destroy this deadly cancer of human liberty and equality. After all, at issue is not the loss of freedom to 4 million Africans, but the survival of human liberty. The world, therefore, should not condone the perpetuation of one of the greatest political crimes in human history." Malcolm X was attempting to get African Americans also recognized in this case, and to also get this kind of international support for our liberation. This is the half of the story that has never been told. In March 1968, you have this FBI memo, which says, "For maximum effectiveness of the counterintelligence programs and for long-range goals are being set. 1, prevent the coalition of militant Black nationalist groups. 2, prevent the rise of a messiah who could unify and electrify the militant Black nationalist movement. Malcolm X might have been such a messiah. He is the martyr of the movement today. Martin Luther King, Stokely Carmichael, and Elijah Muhammad all aspire to this position. Elijah Muhammad is less of a threat because of his age. King could be a very real contender for this position should he abandon his supposed obedience to white liberal doctrines and embrace Black nationalism. Carmichael has the necessary charisma to be a real threat in this way. 3, prevent violence on the part of Black nationalist groups. This is of primary importance. 4, prevent militant Black nationalist groups and leaders from gaining respectability by discrediting them. You must discredit those groups and individuals first to the responsible Negro community. Second, they must be discredited to the white community. So this is the official plan of the United States government in response to Malcolm, in response to this liberation movement, in response to our struggle for true freedom and liberation. The desire of all of our ancestors prior to the Civil War to return to their fatherland, their motherland. The desire of our ancestors from the period of 1919 to 1954, right? This has always been our desire. And each time we get close, the United States government inserts itself. They co-opt the movement. They use a program of integration to distract us from achieving our liberation in either establishing our own nation or going back to Africa. Civil rights ideology appeared to extol the noblesse oblige embodied in Du Bois' expression, the talented tenth. However, the obligations of the talented tenth were often fulfilled symbolically in the pursuit of individual career advancement, as opposed to a lifetime orientation of service to the Black community. The two most well-known Black civil rights organizations were the first to desert the Civil Rights Coalition as a result of their co-optation by 1965. And both organizations prematurely felt that African Americans had won unrestricted and routine access to governmental power, and by 1965 could work from the inside through mainstream political institutions, as opposed to the outside vehicle of protest. Dr. King, however, was searching for a militant, though still nonviolent tactic for social disruption. In Chicago, King said, "We'll use something that avoids violence but becomes militant and extreme enough to disrupt the flow of the city." That tactic that Dr. King formulated was the Poor People's Campaign in Washington, D.C. If necessary, the campaign would disrupt governmental power so that business as usual could not take place. King described his march as, "They haven't seen anything like the march we're going to have. Next time, we won't take our white friends, we won't take signs already painted, and we won't buy round-trip tickets." When Dr. Martin Luther King started speaking out on international issues, reparations, and the mistake he made of integrating the Negro into a burning house, he was killed too. A year after, Emperor Haile Selassie visited the United States again, remembering the work of his friend, Martin Luther King Sr., who raised money for him during the Ethiopian defense of freedom against the Italian invasion. And he went and he laid a wreath on Martin Luther King's grave because he never did have the opportunity to meet with him like he did with Malcolm X. Now, by 1969, Newsweek had reported, right, that 68% of Black people under the age of 30 approve of the idea of Black power, 36% believe violence will be necessary, 50% believe the riots helped, and 27% wanted a separate nation of their own. This was in 1969. Compare that today and the number of people talking about a Black nation, a Republic of New Africa today. So the question that we ask now are, where are the revolutionaries now? The subtitle to this particular article says, "Fiery Black militants of the 1960s have all but disappeared." Now, by 1978, you have National Security Council Memorandum 46, right? Presidential review of this memorandum to the Secretary of State, Secretary of Defense, Director of Central Intelligence. Subject, Black Africa and the U.S. Black Movement. In Section 3, it says, inhibit any pressure by radical African leaders and organizations on the U.S. Black community for the latter to exert influence on the policy of the administration towards Africa. In their recommendations, it says, inhibit coordinated activity of the Black movement in the United States. Special clandestine operations should be launched by the CIA to generate mistrust and hostility in America and world opinion against joint activity of the two forces, and to cause division among Black African radical national groups and their leaders. And finally, the FBI should mount surveillance operations against Black African representatives and collect sensitive information on those, especially at the UN, who oppose US policy. After Black Reconstruction in 1877, and then again after the destruction of the Black Power movement and National Security Council Memorandum 46 in 1978, through force, exploitation, and deprivation of social necessities, Black people internalized the notions of minority status and remained isolated from and ignorant of the larger world. They came to believe that physical resistance was impossible. African Americans were conditioned to believe that the violence which maintained white superiority and Black subordination could be minimized only through conforming with a code of behavior which at every turn symbolized racial power discrepancies and Black acceptance of them. The African American community in the United States, while largely a numerical minority, occupied the Black Belt South and was dispersed in urban areas. The internal organization and solidarity of this race in the United States was low. The African American community at that time was more a loose coalition of organizations and independent institutions, which often had to construct consensus around important issues from one crisis period to the next. Racism alienated the community from the domestic white majority, especially in northern urban areas where the new demands of the movement were emerging. The Black community in this country has today few historic and continuing links to any ancestral power centers in Africa or to sources of support in the international arena. There is still a lack of understanding of the African American nationalist tradition and the context within which it reemerged in the 1960s. Little is known or understood about the important integrationist nationalist debate of this same period. If this generation of African American youth is to be oriented toward revolutionary options, it must deepen its understanding of the African American protest tradition and the ideological and programmatic alternatives between which they must choose. The study of Malcolm X is important because he was the best critic of an era and a movement which still holds significance for us today. Malcolm asked the right questions, some of which he found answers for. We must know these questions and answers so that we don't recreate the wheel. The Black liberation movement developed in the latter 1960s in marked contrast to the integrationist civil rights movement. It was repressed violently by the agents of the state. Even today, it represents the only significant alternative to civil rights integrationism that African Americans have ever developed. This movement, for a time, energized those groups in the ghetto who are today vilified as the underclass. Our present oppression as a people is tied to the defeat and destruction of the Black liberation movement. It is also tied to the sanctification of Black electoral politics within the confines of the Democratic Party, the sainthood of Dr. King, and the canon of nonviolence. This sanctification stood as an alternative to the mobilization of poor and dispossessed African Americans outside of the institutions of electoral, legislative, and executive politics, which are institutionally structured to maintain powerlessness. A rejuvenated Black liberation movement can be constructed, but only upon an accurate understanding of the strengths and weaknesses, the accuracies and errors of our previous major efforts at rebellion. Critically studying Malcolm X is central to this reconstruction and rebuilding effort. With a few notable exceptions in the tradition of Malcolm X, like the National Black Independent Political Party and the National Black United Front from the period of 1979 to 1981. The dominant strategic motion in the Black community has come from those in the tradition, not of Malcolm X, but of Martin Luther King Jr. Their bankruptcy and that of Black electoral politics, from the perspective of resolving the pressing needs of the masses of ghettoized Black people, has engendered a renewed interest in Malcolm X and the Pan-African nationalist and internationalist tradition, of which he was the most elegant spokesman in the latter part of the 20th century. While many years have passed, the questions which the Black liberation movement addressed are still with us. The groupings in the Black community are even more distinct and opposed than in Malcolm's time. And we should not forget that, as Malcolm X said, if you want to know a thing, you must know its origins. We're still fighting for a seat at the table instead of building our own. Mumia Abu-Jamal said, "It has taken a while to reach this conclusion, but upon reflection, it is inescapable. Why, after over half a century of Black voting and the election of more Black political leaders than at any time since Reconstruction, are the lives, fortunes, prospects, and hopes of Black people so grim? One is forced to conclude that Black America suffers maladies similar to those faced by continental African nations, a segregated neo-colonial system in which a political class gives the appearance of freedom and independence while perpetuating racial oppression and financial exploitation. If Black politicians are to do the very same thing as their white colleagues, why have them at all? What's the difference? Neocolonialism at home and abroad." Since Malcolm X's murder, several groups have attempted to follow his instructions to move the African American struggle from civil rights to international human rights. 9 major initiatives at the United Nations were attempted with no success, largely because of a lack of support from any African nation and lack of support from African Americans themselves. Few African Americans study international law as it pertains to the issue of colonized people's rights to self-determination, and the American public, Black and white, suffer from international legal illiteracy. The 2016 United Nations Working Group of Experts of People of African Descent came to the United States and brought global awareness to the African American situation. They emphasized that the United States has not signed and ratified any of the human rights treaties that would allow United States citizens to present individual complaints to the United Nations human rights treaty bodies or to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. There is therefore no recognition or support by the United States government for African Americans in the United States to exercise their First Amendment right to individually petition the government for a redress of grievances, nor to exercise their human rights under international law to present individual complaints to the United Nations human rights treaty bodies or to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. The 2016 United Nations Working Group of Experts of People of African Descent also said, "We would have to do the work on the ground," meaning the African American community. A small group of activists responded by doing the work, filing a declaration of self-determination on October 10th, in October of 2017. And this was presented to the OHCHR in Geneva in March 2018 and accepted. All the required notifications to the UN and State Department were made following that, and a request to the UN Decolonization Committee to list African Americans on the decolonization list was made in October 2018. The request has not been answered. On January 25th of this year, The following recommendations were sent to the White House in response to the President Biden's executive order on advancing racial equity and support for underserved communities through the federal government. Recommendation 1. Your Domestic Policy Council follow the recommendations of the report of the Office of the United Nations High Commission for Human Rights compilation on the United States of America to, quote, establish a high-level interagency working group called the United States Working Group on Human Rights with a mandate to oversee and coordinate the implementation of the international human rights obligations of the United States domestically. Recommendation 2. The United States Working Group on Human Rights to submit to the Director of the Office of Management and Budget a report within 200 days on legal reform to benefit the Afro-descendant nation's ability to exercise its human rights. Recommendation 3. The report shall include a plan to assist the Afro-descendant nations' request to the UN Decolonization Committee to list us on the decolonization list that was made in October 2018. 4. The report shall include a plan for conducting a United Nations-sponsored plebiscite for self-determination for descendants of people who survived the criminal and genocidal Middle Passage to the colonies that became the United States of America. Such a United States Working Group on Human Rights could then make as its highest priority the ratification of the human rights treaties that would allow United States citizens to present individual complaints to the United Nations Human Rights Treaty bodies or to the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. In addition, such a working group could then begin to implement the Agenda for Black America's Restoration and Self-Determination, while facilitating the Afro-descendant nation request to the UN Decolonization Committee. Were the United States to do this, it could then legitimately claim to be making progress towards protecting the human rights domestically. And that is the half of the story that hasn't been told. And now I really look forward to having a discussion and answering questions about Malcolm X's legacy and what we need to be doing now to fulfill.